Everyone says the same thing about buying a house. Work hard, save for a while, and eventually you'll get there. True, it might take longer for you than it did for your parents. Maybe you rent for a few more years, or you move back home for a while. I know. That's a little embarrassing, but it is temporary. Buying a house is not impossible. It's just delayed. That's the story anyway. Somewhere in here, somebody's uncle brings up avocado toast, right on schedule. What? No, not now. Anyway, for a long time, that story was even sort of true. Actually, that's backwards. This was never a patience problem. It's a math problem, and the math changed permanently somewhere along the way. The median home in America right now costs close to 6 times the median household income. For most of the last 50 years, that number sat closer to 3 or 4 times the median income. That's not a small shift. That's the difference between a plan that takes a decade and a plan that takes 2, using the same amount of discipline and the same haircut you've had since college. You didn't get unlucky with timing. The finish line kept moving, and it's still moving right now as you watch this. It's worth asking why that ratio blew out in the first place, because it's really not much of a mystery. The population kept growing. The number of new homes built per household did not keep pace, especially in the cities where the jobs were. A lot of those cities made it outrightly illegal to build anything, except a single detached house on most residential land. So even when demand for housing doubled, the legal supply of new housing barely moved at all. Add a decade of historically cheap borrowing on top of that, which let anyone who already had money or equity bid more for the same fixed number of houses, and you get exactly the kind of price growth that outruns income growth for 20 straight years. Keep that zoning detail in your back pocket, because it comes back later. Now, the short story, mostly because I lacked the emotional stamina to explain the long version. In 1981, the typical first-time homebuyer in America was 29 years old. Not rich, not lucky, just 29. Save a bit, get a mortgage, buy a house. That was basically the entire plot. Fast forward to right now, according to the National Association of Realtors, the median first-time buyer is 40 years old. Yes, 40. That's not the result of a one-year blip. It's the highest that number has ever been recorded, and it's been climbing for over a decade straight. Somewhere between 1981 and now, an entire extra decade got quietly inserted into the plan. Nobody voted on that. Nobody announced it. It just happened. One mortgage rate and one price hike at a time. And it's not just the age that moved. About 22% of today's first-time buyers only get there with a cash gift or a loan from family. Back in 1981, that wasn't popular because you mostly didn't need one. So the short story isn't really about one 29-year-old and one 40-year-old. It's about the second one needing a cosigner the first one's generation never had to ask for. So there's actually 4 different things doing this to you at once, and once you see all 4, the just work hard version of this story stops making any sense. The first one is the math itself. The median US home right now runs somewhere around $430,000. Mortgage rates are sitting around 6.4%. Put 20% down on that house and finance the rest, and the payment on the loan alone comes out to just over $2,100 a month. That's before property tax, before insurance, which is brutal in its own right. Stretch that loan out over 30 years, and you're not just paying back the roughly $344,000 you borrowed. You're handing over close to another $430,000 in interest on top of it, which means the bank effectively buys the same house you did, using your own money, without ever once showing up to an open house. In 1981, a 29-year-old wasn't smarter than you, or more disciplined, or better with money. They were standing on a completely different set of numbers, and wages never came close to moving fast enough to close that gap. And before you ask, no, just renting forever isn't some secret hack around all these. Median rent nationally is still meaningfully cheaper than that $2,100 monthly mortgage payment, which is exactly why a lot of people who could technically qualify for a loan are choosing to keep renting instead. But rent doesn't build you any equity, and for the first several years, neither does a mortgage payment really, since most of an early payment is interest, not principal. So renting saves you money today. Buying is supposed to be a forced savings account for later, and right now, neither one is quietly building the kind of position a 29-year-old in 1981 could count on by default. Okay, so if the math is this bad, why isn't everyone selling? You'd think more people would want out. That's the second thing, the lock-in effect. Here's the actual reason, and it's almost funny. almost. Around 70% of existing mortgages in America are locked in below 5%. A huge share of those sit in the 3% range, from back when the Fed was practically giving money away to help keep the lights on. Picture someone sitting on a $300,000 loan at 3%. Their payment is somewhere around $1,265 a month. Sell that house, buy a new one at today's price and today's rate, and that same person is suddenly staring at a payment more than double what they're used to, for a house that might not even be nicer. So they don't sell. It's less housing market and more a very slow, very expensive game of musical chairs where most of the chairs are glued to the floor. Nobody's handing back a 3% mortgage to go get a 6.4% one out of the goodness of their heart. The people who'd normally be listing their starter homes right now just aren't, and the country is sitting on a supply gap estimated at somewhere around 4 million homes, largely because of exactly this. So who is still buying and selling in this market? Mostly people who don't need a mortgage to do it. Boomers reportedly make up something like 42% of all buyers right now, and over half of all sellers, because equity and cash don't care what the rate is. The supply that's supposed to filter down to you is sitting there, locked, on purpose, indefinitely, held by exactly the people who don't need to move it in the first place. And it doesn't stop at buyers either, because everyone who can or won't buy is still competing for the same shrinking pool of rentals, which is exactly why rent has been climbing right alongside a housing market that's supposedly cooling off. Fine, you might be thinking, current owners are stuck. But homes change hands eventually anyway. People retire, people die. Surely some of that filters down. That's the third thing, where all that wealth actually sits. Here's the part that actually stings a little. Baby boomers currently hold somewhere around $19 trillion in housing wealth. That's something like half of all the home equity that exists in the entire country, sitting with one generation. Millennials, despite being a bigger generation, are sitting on something closer to $5 trillion. About 8 in 10 Americans over 65 own their home outright, and only around 19% of them still carry any mortgage at all. So yes, that boomer wealth does eventually move. But it doesn't just fall into your lap the way the story implies. A lot of it gets spent first, specifically on long-term care, which has gotten absurdly expensive. The median cost of a nursing home has gone from around $65,000 a year in the early 2000s to well over $100,000 a year now. Private equity firms have noticed exactly how reliable that revenue is, because a steady stream of homeowners selling to pay for their own care is a wonderful business if you happen to be the one running the facility. Increasingly, that means selling the house to pay a facility bill before anyone ever gets to inherit it. And whatever's left over after that doesn't spread evenly either. By some estimates, only about 6% of Americans currently own property they inherited, and only around 3% live in a home that was actually passed down to them. It concentrates mostly in families who were already doing fine, because that's just how already having money tends to work. The house isn't some safety net quietly coming for everyone. For a lot of people, it's already spoken for, usually by a facility, occasionally by a sibling with a better lawyer. And when a house does make it through intact, it doesn't always stay in one piece either. A house is one asset, and it often comes with several heirs attached to it. And when nobody agrees on keeping it, renting it out, or splitting the work of managing it, the simplest way to end that argument is usually to sell the place and split the cash. That puts the house right back on the market for whoever can outbid everyone else for it, which increasingly means an investor with cash already sitting there, not a 32-year-old with a pre-approval letter and a dream. Which brings us to the fourth thing. Now here's the part where I'm supposed to tell you the government just fixed all of this. To be fair, they actually tried. The 21st Century Road to Housing Act just became law. It does some genuinely reasonable things. It bans companies that already own 350 or more single-family homes from buying any more of them. It kills the old rule that forced manufactured homes to be built on a permanent chassis, like they might need to drive away in the middle of the night. It lets cities use federal housing money to build homes instead of just paperwork about homes. Remember that zoning problem from earlier, the one that helped blow out the price-to-income ratio in the first place? This bill actually goes after a piece of it, pushing cities toward looser rules on how densely they're allowed to build. It even opens a small pilot program for mortgages under $100,000, in places where that size of loan had basically stopped existing because no lender wanted to bother. there's a modest annual fund attached too, somewhere around $200 million a year, specifically to reward cities that can actually prove their housing supply grew instead of just promising it will. On paper, that's a real sensible piece of legislation, and if you told me a decade ago that housing economists were going to get even half of that wish list, I'd have been mildly impressed. Here's the turn though, because there's always a turn. The investor ban doesn't even switch on for another 180 days. Almost everything else in the bill needs new rules written by federal agencies before it does anything at all, which means right now, today, there is exactly zero measured effect on how much a house costs or how many are actually getting built. It might help. Genuinely, it might eventually, assuming the rulemaking actually happens on schedule, which is its own separate bet entirely. But eventually is doing a lot of work in that sentence, and you've already heard that word once in this video. So no, your kids probably won't be locked out of home ownership because they didn't try hard enough. Or because you didn't either. It was never about who worked harder or who saved better or who skipped enough avocado toast to matter. They'll just be standing at the edge of the same math, one election cycle and one interest rate later, wondering why nobody warned them it moved again.